Imagine this. You're a pilot. It's 1979. You're flying a small Cessna low over the Caribbean. No flight plan filed, no radar contact. Below you, turquoise water. Ahead, a tiny Bahamian island appears. Palm trees, white sand, and a 3,300-foot private runway carved into the jungle. You touch down. Armed guards in jeeps materialize from the tree line. Dobermans strain at their leashes. Radar dishes sweep the sky above you. You've just landed on Norman's Cay, and the cargo in your hold isn't luggage. This island, 210 miles southeast of Florida, was the most dangerous piece of real estate in the Western Hemisphere. It was the beating heart of a cocaine empire that flooded American cities with 80% of all the cocaine consumed in the United States during the 1980s. And the man who built it from the ground up was a German Colombian with a Beatles obsession, a Hitler fixation, and the singular vision to turn drug smuggling from a cottage industry into an industrial operation. His name was Carlos Lehder. And the story of how he built his empire starts in a prison cell. Carlos Enrique Lehder Rivas was born on September 7th, 1949, in Armenia, Colombia, a quiet coffee-growing city in the heart of the Andes. His father, Wilhelm Lehder, was a German engineer who had emigrated to Colombia in the late 1920s. His mother, Helena Rivas, was a Colombian schoolteacher. On paper, a respectable middle-class family, but the household was complicated. Wilhelm Lehder held Nazi sympathies, reportedly appearing on U.S. embassy watch lists in Colombia during World War II. Young Carlos grew up reading Mein Kampf alongside Beatles albums, mixing ideology with rebellion in a way that would define his worldview for life. When Carlos was 15, his parents divorced. His mother took him to New York City. And New York in the mid-1960s was a revelation for a restless teenager with no money and no limits. The city showed him what wealth looked like, and exactly how far he was from it. He started stealing cars, first in New York, then Michigan, even smuggling stolen vehicles back to Colombia through a brother's dealership. It wasn't about the money yet. It was about the feeling, the thrill of the system not catching him. Psychologists call this reward-driven risk-taking, when the dopamine hit from getting away with something becomes more powerful than the fear of consequences. In 1973, at 23 years old, Lehder was arrested for smuggling 200 pounds of marijuana in a stolen car and sentenced to 2 years at the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut. And that prison would change everything, because inside Danbury, Carlos Lehder met George Jung. Jung was already running a marijuana smuggling operation using small private aircraft, low-altitude routes that slipped under radar. The two men spent months plotting in the same prison yard. Lehder was fixated on one detail. Jung was flying marijuana, but cocaine weighed a fraction of the same volume, sold for 10 times the price, and demand was exploding across American cities. The plan that would terrorize the United States was born in a federal prison cafeteria. When Lehder walked out of Danbury in 1975, he had a vision that nobody else in the drug world had yet grasped. At the time, cocaine entered the United States one way, through human drug mules swallowed in condoms or packed into suitcases, 1 kilogram at a time through commercial airports. The entire operation depended on individuals. It was slow, it was lossy, it was small. Lehder saw the same model that built the Industrial Revolution and applied it to cocaine. Stop thinking about individual mules. Start thinking about aircraft. Stop thinking about kilograms. Start thinking about tons. He linked up with Pablo Escobar and the Ochoa brothers in Colombia. Escobar had the product. Lehder had the logistics. Together, they co-founded what would become the Medellín Cartel. But to run a full-scale aerial smuggling operation, Lehder needed something no other trafficker had thought to acquire: a base of operation, a private hub positioned perfectly between Colombia and Florida, close enough for a refueled light aircraft, remote enough to be invisible. He found it in the Exuma chain of the Bahamas, Norman's Cay, a tiny island roughly 210 miles southeast of Miami, barely on any map. It had around 100 houses, a quiet marina, a yacht club, and a small private airstrip used by weekend boaters. In 1977, Lehder began buying property on the island through a front company called International Dutch Resources, registered in Nassau. He bought quietly at first, then aggressively, then by force. Residents who refused to sell had their cisterns destroyed, their boats shot up, their buildings vandalized. Armed Germans loyal to Lehder patrolled the beaches. Dobermans ran loose at night. One by one, the legitimate inhabitants packed up and fled. By 1978, Norman's Cay belonged to Carlos Lehder. He spent $5 million extending the airstrip to 3,300 feet. He installed radar systems. He built fuel depots. He erected armed guard towers. He turned a sleepy Bahamian holiday island into the most sophisticated private drug operation in history. And he bribed Bahamian Prime Minister Lyndon Pindling so thoroughly that the government looked the other way entirely. A royal commission later found that Pindling had spent 8 times his reported income between 1977 and 1984. Now, pay attention to this part, because the scale of what happened next is almost impossible to comprehend. At its peak, Norman's Cay processed an estimated 300 kilograms of cocaine per day. Planes flew in from Colombia, offloaded their cargo, refueled, and dispatched smaller aircraft to abandoned airstrips in Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas. Court records show the very first shipment Lehder ran netted a $1 million profit in 2 days. He personally retained 1 kilogrammeter of cocaine from every 4 that passed through the island. Investigators later estimated that Lehder's network was responsible for supplying as much as 80% of all cocaine entering the United States during the early 1980s. He was reportedly earning up to $300 million per year. This is the psychology of systems thinking, weaponized for crime. Lehder didn't just traffic drugs. He built infrastructure. He created redundancy. He thought like a logistics CEO, not a street dealer. And that difference in mindset is exactly what made him so catastrophically effective. Life on Norman's Cay was surreal. Lehder threw cocaine-fueled parties that lasted for days. He surrounded himself with beautiful women, German bodyguards, and an ever-growing ego that his partners in Colombia were beginning to find dangerous. He flew a personal fleet of aircraft. He had a helicopter, radar, his own private army. And he was becoming increasingly unhinged, consuming the cocaine he was supposed to be selling in extraordinary quantities himself. And he was loud about it. He gave Colombian media interviews bragging openly about the operation. He called cocaine Latin America's atom bomb. He wrote a letter to President Carter offering to pay off Colombia's entire national debt in exchange for immunity. He founded the National Latin Movement, a neo-fascist political party built entirely around blocking extradition to the United States. Pablo Escobar watched all of this with growing fury. Escobar was meticulous about secrecy. Lehder was turning himself into a tabloid villain. By 1982, under sustained U.S. pressure, the Bahamian government finally cracked down on Norman's Cay. Lehder was forced to shut down operations and flee back to Colombia. The walls were closing in, and his best ally was beginning to consider him a liability. On February 4th, 1987, Colombian National Police raided a cattle ranch near the town of Guarne in the Antioquia Mountains. They found Lehder mid-party, surrounded by his entourage, drunk on his own invincibility. Within hours of his arrest, he was on a plane to Jacksonville, Florida. He became the first high-profile Colombian drug trafficker ever extradited to the United States. The tip that led authorities to him. Investigators and journalists have long believed it came from Pablo Escobar himself. The trial lasted 7 months, one of the longest and most complex drug prosecutions in American history. Lehder was convicted on all 11 counts. On July 20th, 1988, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole, plus an additional 135 years. Attorney General Edwin Meese called the conviction one of the greatest victories in the war on drugs, but Lehder had one card left to play. He offered to testify against Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega, revealing that Noriega had allowed Panama to serve as a cocaine transit corridor. His cooperation was enough. His sentence was dramatically reduced to 55 years. He was released from U.S. custody on June 15, 2020, and deported to Germany. On March 28, 2025, Lehder, now 75 years old, recovering from cancer, landed at Bogota's El Dorado airport and was immediately arrested on outstanding Colombian charges. Within days, a judge ruled the statute of limitations had expired. He walked free. The man who flooded America with cocaine, who corrupted a government, who built a private narco island, walked out of a Colombian courtroom a free man at 75. Carlos Lehder isn't just a criminal story. He's a masterclass in what happens when entrepreneurial genius is pointed in the wrong direction. Every skill Lehder had was legitimate. Systems thinking, logistics innovation, political organizing, risk management. In a different context, he could have built a shipping empire. But those paths weren't visible to a poor immigrant kid stealing cars in 1960s New York. That's the opportunity gap at the heart of this story. Talent without legitimate pathways doesn't disappear. It redirects. There's also the illusion of ideology. Lehder genuinely believed he was fighting American imperialism by selling cocaine to Americans. He dressed catastrophic harm to millions as political resistance. This psychological trick let him maintain a self-image as a revolutionary while destroying communities across the United States. And for the victims, the users, the neighborhoods, the families wrecked by the 1980s crack cocaine epidemic, there's the brutal truth about supply-driven demand. Lehder didn't create addiction, but he industrialized the supply chain so efficiently that cocaine transformed from a rich man's indulgence into a street-level crisis America is still recovering from. When one man's logistical genius reshapes an entire country's drug epidemic, who is truly responsible for the damage? What do you think? Is Carlos Lehder a criminal, a twisted entrepreneur, or both? Drop your answer in the comments.